Before mechanical clocks, time was a different thing. It was natural. It flowed with the sun and the seasons. People didn't think in minutes or seconds, they thought in larger, softer chunks of the day. The sun was the main clock for everyone. It rose, it crossed the sky, and it set. That was the rhythm of life. You could tell the time of day by the sun's position. Or you could look at the length of your shadow. Farmers knew when to work and when to rest based on the light. A day's work was from sunrise to sunset. The hours themselves weren't even the same length. In summer, the daylight hours were long. In winter, they were short. An hour was just a fraction of the available daylight, so a summer hour was much longer than a winter one. This made sense. It matched the world people lived in. Sundials were a more formal way to use the sun. They were simple. A stick or a pointer, called a gnomon, cast a shadow on a marked dial. As the sun moved, the shadow moved. They were effective, but they had a big problem. They didn't work at night, and they didn't work on cloudy days. In places like England, that was a lot of days. They were also fixed to one location. You couldn't carry a sundial around and expect it to work accurately unless it was designed for your specific latitude. So people found other ways to measure time when the sun was hiding. One of the oldest was the water clock, or clepsydra. It was basically a container with a small hole in the bottom. Water dripped out at a mostly steady rate. You could mark levels on the inside of the container to show how much time had passed. This was better than a sundial in some ways. It worked at night, it worked on cloudy days. Yes, but water clocks had their own issues. The water flow could change as the pressure dropped in the container. The hole could get clogged with sediment, and in the cold winters of northern Europe, the water would freeze. That made them useless. Another method was the candle clock. A candle was made to a standard size and weight. Marks were painted on its side. As the candle burned down, it passed the marks, showing that a certain amount of time had gone by. Some even had small nails stuck in the wax at the hour marks. When the wax melted, the nail would fall and clatter onto a metal dish below, acting as a simple alarm. They were clever, but candles didn't burn perfectly evenly. A draft could make one burn faster. A poorly made candle might burn slower. They were an approximation, not a precise measurement. For most people, this was fine. Life didn't demand precision. You ate when you were hungry. You slept when you were tired. The day was governed by the sun and the work that needed doing. But there was one part of medieval society that needed something better: the monasteries. Monastic life was built on a strict schedule. Monks and nuns lived by the rule of St. Benedict. This rule divided the day and night into a series of prayer times called the canonical hours. There were 7 services during the day and one in the middle of the night. These prayers had to happen at specific times every day, all year round. The bell had to be rung to call the community to the chapel. It was a divine schedule. And that was the problem. How do you know when to ring the bell for vigils in the dead of a cloudy night? How do you keep the services evenly spaced? The monk in charge of ringing the bell, the sacristan, had a heavy responsibility. He might use a water clock or a candle clock. He might look at the stars on a clear night. But it wasn't consistent. The community's spiritual life depended on the schedule. They needed a machine, a reliable, all-weather day and night device to keep God's time. This need, more than anything else, was the spark that led to the invention of the mechanical clock. It wasn't about business or science at first, it was about prayer. The desire for a better way to wake up monks in the dark pushed Europe toward one of its most important inventions. The first mechanical clocks were not like any clock we know today. They were huge. They were made of iron, and they were noisy. They were less like timekeepers and more like industrial machines. They didn't sit on a mantelpiece. They were built into the stone walls of cathedrals and bell towers. And most of them didn't even have a face. No hands, no dial. Their only job was to ring a bell. They were striking clocks. Their purpose was to make a sound at the right time, not to show the time visually. The invention that made it all possible was a brilliant piece of engineering called the escapement. Specifically, the verge and foliate escapement. It sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. It was the first device that could turn a continuous force into a series of regular ticks. Imagine the clock's power source. It was a heavy weight, often a big stone or lump of lead, tied to a rope. The rope was wrapped around a drum or a barrel. Gravity pulled the weight down. This made the barrel turn. If that was all there was, the weight would just fall to the ground and the rope would unwind in a few seconds. The challenge was to make that fall happen very, very slowly and in a controlled way. This is where the escapement came in. The turning barrel was connected to a series of gears. These gears increased the speed of rotation. The final gear in the series was a special one called the crown wheel. It looked like a crown with jagged, saw-like teeth pointing upwards. Poised just above this spinning wheel was a vertical rod called the verge. At the top of the verge was a crossbar called the foliate. The foliate was a horizontal bar with small weights on either end. You could slide these weights in and out to adjust the speed. The verge rod wasn't plain. It had two small metal flags, or pallets, sticking out from it, one near the top and one near the bottom. They were set at an angle to each other. Now picture the action. The crown wheel is trying to spin fast because of the falling weight. But a tooth on the wheel catches the top pallet, stopping the wheel and giving the foliate a little push. This makes the foliate bar start to swing. As it swings, it moves the top pallet out of the way of the tooth. For a split second, the wheel is free and turns a little, but as the top pallet moves out, the bottom pallet swings in, right into the path of the tooth on the other side of the wheel. Clack. The wheel is stopped again, but this stop gives the foliate a push in the opposite direction. It swings back. The bottom pallet moves out of the way, the wheel turns a tiny bit, and the top pallet swings back in. Tick. The wheel is stopped. Tock. It's stopped again. This constant starting and stopping, this tick-tock motion is what controlled the clock. It was an escape of energy in small, regular bursts. That's why it was called an escapement. It was a crude but effective regulator. It slowed the fall of the main weight from a few seconds to a whole day. Connected to this gear train was another mechanism. After a certain number of turns, it would release a lever that caused a hammer to strike a large bell. That was the whole point. The great iron machine would sit in the dark tower, ticking and clacking loudly, until on the hour it would trigger a loud clang that could be heard across the monastery or the town. These early clocks were incredibly inaccurate by our standards. The verge and foliate mechanism was sensitive to friction and the condition of the gears. They might gain or lose 15 minutes or even half an hour in a single day. A clock keeper had to constantly adjust them, usually by checking a sundial on a clear day and then moving the weights on the foliate bar in or out. Moving the weights in made the clock run faster. Moving them out made it run slower. It was a constant process of correction, but even with their flaws, they were a huge leap forward. They were mechanical, they worked day and night in sun and in cloud. They were the first automated machines to become a regular part of public life. They were the iron giants that began to shout the hours to the world. Who were the people who built these first clocks? There was no job title of clockmaker in the 14th century. The skills needed to build a huge iron clock didn't exist in one person or one trade. These early creators were masters of metal. They were blacksmiths, locksmiths, and sometimes skilled monks working in their own monastery forges. They were practical men who understood how to heat, hammer, and cut iron. They were not scientists or theorists. They were craftsmen. The work was hard, physical labor. The primary material was wrought iron. It was tough and difficult to work with. The clockmaker started with raw iron bars. He would heat them in a forge until they glowed red or white hot. Then, using a hammer and an anvil, he would shape the pieces. He would forge the frame of the clock, the thick arbors that held the gears, and the heavy levers for the striking mechanism. It was loud, hot, and smoky work. Making the gears was the most difficult part. There were no precision cutting machines. Each gear or wheel had to be made by hand. The clockmaker would start by forging a rough iron ring. Then, he would painstakingly cut the teeth. He would mark out the spaces for the teeth as best he could, perhaps using a compass or dividers. Then he would use a file and a chisel to cut each individual tooth. It was slow, tedious work. The teeth were not perfectly uniform. Each one was slightly different. A large clock could have several wheels, each with dozens of teeth. The amount of filing required was immense, and the parts had to fit together. This was the real art. The clockmaker had no detailed blueprints or mathematical formulas to guide him. From experience, from intuition, and from a lot of trial and error. He would forge a part, file it, and then test it to see if it fit with the other part. If it didn't, he would file it some more, or maybe even heat it up and reforge it. It was a process of constant adjustment. Every clock was a unique, custom-built machine. The parts from one clock would not fit in another. The tools they used were simple but effective. They had hammers of different sizes, tongs to hold the hot metal, chisels for cutting, and files of various shapes and coarseness for finishing. They had a hand crank drill or a bow drill to make holes for the pivots. The forge was the heart of the workshop, where the raw material was made workable. It was a world away from the delicate work of a modern watchmaker with their tiny screwdrivers and tweezers. This was heavy engineering. The first clockmakers were often anonymous. We know of some early ones by name, like Richard of Wallingford, an abbot at St. Albans Abbey in England. He was a brilliant man, a scholar of mathematics and astronomy, who designed and built an incredibly complex astronomical clock in the 1330s. It was far more than a simple timekeeper. It showed the positions of the sun, moon, and stars. But men like him were rare. Most were unnamed blacksmiths hired by a town council or a cathedral chapter. They were seen as skilled artisans like a master carpenter or stonemason, not as revolutionary inventors. Their work was a public spectacle. The construction of a town clock was a major civic project. People would watch as the heavy iron frame was hoisted into the bell tower. The installation was a difficult and dangerous job. Once it was running, the clock needed constant maintenance. The clockkeeper, or rector, had to climb the tower every day to wind the heavy weights back up. This was often done with a large, strenuous hand crank. He also had to lubricate the moving parts with animal fat or oil to reduce friction and wear. He had to constantly adjust the foliate weights to try and keep the clock accurate. It was a demanding job. These men didn't just make time, they wrestled with it day after day in cold, dark towers. The arrival of the mechanical clock changed society in a fundamental way. It wasn't a sudden change. It happened slowly, over generations, but it was profound. The clock didn't just measure the day, it redefined it. It imposed a new artificial rhythm on human life. At first, the impact was felt most strongly within the walls of the monasteries, where the clocks were born. The clock brought a new level of precision and discipline to the monastic schedule. The bells rang at the correct times, day and night. The routine of prayer, work, and study became more rigid, more machine-like. The clock was a tool for spiritual order, but soon clocks began to appear in the centers of towns and cities. A public clock was a huge investment. It was a statement. A town with a clock was a modern, prosperous, and well-ordered place. The clock tower often became the most important building in town after the church. It was a source of immense civic pride. Towns competed with each other to have the most impressive clock. Some were decorated with moving figures, called automata. On the hour, mechanical knights might joust, or apostles might parade past a figure of Christ. These were public spectacles, a form of entertainment, and a demonstration of the town's wealth and technical skill. The sound of the clock bell created a new shared experience for the community. Before, everyone's sense of time was personal and local. A farmer's day was different from a merchant's, but the clock bell was for everyone. It rang out over the fields and the marketplace. It divided the day into equal numbered hours. This was a radical idea. The concept of the equal hour changed everything. Remember, the old system had seasonal hours that stretched in the summer and shrank in the winter. The clock introduced the 24-hour day, where every hour was exactly the same length, regardless of the season or the amount of daylight. At first, many clocks were set to ring 24 hours, starting from sunset, a system known as Italian time. But gradually, the system of two 12-hour cycles, from midnight to noon and noon to midnight, became standard. This new uniform time started to regulate public life. The ringing of the morning bell might signal the start of the workday and the opening of the town gates and markets. A bell at noon marked the time for the midday meal. The evening bell signaled the end of the workday, the closing of the markets, and the time for people to be off the streets. The clock imposed a new structure on commerce and labor. Work itself began to change. Instead of working from sunup to sundown, people could now be paid for a set number of hours. The idea of working by the clock was born. This was a huge mental shift. Time was no longer a natural flow. It was a commodity. It could be measured, divided, and sold. This laid the groundwork for the more disciplined and organized world of modern industry. As lawyers began to use the clock to regulate court proceedings, universities used it to schedule lectures. The clock brought a new level of synchronization to urban life. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, clocks started to get smaller. The same basic technology of the tower clocks was scaled down. Wealthy nobles and rich merchants began to commission domestic clocks for their own homes. These were still weight-driven and not very portable, often hung on a wall, but they brought mechanical time into the private sphere for the first time. Owning a clock was a powerful status symbol. It showed you were rich, modern, and in command of your own schedule. The clock changed how people thought. It presented a new metaphor for the universe. Before, the world was seen as an organism, alive and unpredictable. The clock suggested the universe might be a machine, a giant clockwork created by God, the divine clockmaker. It was an orderly, predictable, and knowable system. This mechanical worldview was a departure from older, more mystical ways of thinking, and would have a massive influence on the scientific revolution that was to come. The simple iron machine in the tower was teaching humanity to think in a new way. For all its revolutionary impact, the medieval clock was not a good timekeeper. The verge and foliate escapement was a brilliant invention, but it had fundamental flaws. Its accuracy was at the mercy of many variables. Friction was a constant enemy. The hand-filed iron gears were rough and didn't mesh perfectly. The animal grease used for lubrication would get thick in the cold and thin in the heat, changing the clock's speed. The main driving weight also exerted slightly less force when it was near the bottom of its fall than at the top. Podcasts, and we should probably just release the mirror of the regulator itself. It was just pushed back and forth by the escapement. Its speed was determined by a brute force balance between the driving weight and the inertia of the foliot. Any small change in the driving force would directly affect the rate of the clock. This meant it was inherently unstable. A clock keeper could adjust it one day, but a change in temperature or humidity could throw it off the next. Losing or gaining 15 minutes a day was considered normal. For some very crude clocks, an hour a day was not unheard of. Despite these limitations, clockmakers in the late Middle Ages kept refining their craft. They got better at cutting gears. They developed more complex striking mechanisms that could ring the quarter hours. They added dials with a single-hour hand, allowing people to see the time as well as hear it. The minute hand would not become common until after the invention of a much more accurate escapement. Some of the most spectacular creations were the astronomical clocks, like the one in Prague or Strasbourg. These were masterpieces of medieval engineering and art. They went far beyond telling the hour. They showed the position of the sun and moon in the zodiac, the phases of the moon, the calendar date, and major religious feast days. They were often adorned with complex automata that would perform on the hour. These clocks were more like mechanical computers. They demonstrated a deep fascination with the cosmos and a desire to model its orderly, God-given movements in mechanical form. But underneath all the complexity, they were still powered by the same inaccurate verge and foliot mechanism. They were beautiful and complex, but not precise. The push for greater accuracy continued. Sailors needed better timekeeping for navigation, scientists needed it for their experiments. The medieval clock had created a world that now demanded a level of precision that the clock itself could not provide. It had created its own successor's necessity. The great breakthrough came after the medieval period, in the 17th century. It was the invention of the pendulum clock by the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens. The pendulum was a revolution because, unlike the foliot, it had its own natural period of swing, determined by its length. It wanted to swing back and forth at a constant rate. By connecting this stable oscillator to a new type of escapement, clocks could suddenly be made dramatically more accurate. Timekeeping errors dropped from minutes per day to just seconds per day, but the pendulum clock and all the precise timekeeping that followed stood on the shoulders of the iron giants of the Middle Ages. The anonymous blacksmiths and locksmiths who hammered out the first clocks in their forges started it all. They took on the challenge of mechanizing time. They established the basic principles of a gear train, a weight drive, and an escapement. They created the public clock and the idea of a shared, uniform time. Their crude, noisy, and inaccurate machines were not an endpoint. They were the beginning, they were the first chapter in a long story of humanity's quest to measure, control, and understand time. They built a mechanical worldview piece by heavy iron piece, and its tick-tock echo can still be heard in the rhythm of our modern lives.